Last week, Fan Nation posted an article talking about Carmelo Anthony's first game as a New York Knick in Madison Square Garden, and they also go into Carmelo Anthony's legacy as a New York Knick, and I'm here to break it all down. What's up, guys? It's your boy Dariel from Knicks Digest, and before we move on to today's video, I just want to remind you guys that 80% of you guys watching this video are not subscribed to the channel. We need that number to go up. The 20% of you that are subscribed, thank you very much. We greatly appreciate it. But if you're not subscribed, stop what you're doing right now. Go to the subscription button, smash the subscription button to keep up to date with all the videos that we're coming out with. Moving on to today's video. Like I said in the beginning, Fan Nation posted an article talking about Carmelo Anthony and his first game with the New York Knicks in Madison Square Garden. In this article, Carmelo Anthony was talking about just the feeling that he felt coming onto the court with Diddy and Skylar Graves. I'm coming home, playing in the background in the middle of Madison Square Garden. Basically gave him the goosebumps and how it's a moment that he'll never forget. The article also goes on to talk about Carmelo Anthony's legacy with the New York Knicks. And if we take a look here, the Brooklyn native NBA travel brought him to Manhattan for 7 seasons. While postseason success evaded Anthony's Knicks, he frequently treated MSG visitors to dominant performances that left his name dotted all over the franchise history books. Anthony is one of 7 players to score 10,000 points in a Knick uniform and holds the MSG record in single game scoring. That game where he scored 62 points was against the Charlotte Bobcats at the time, where Kemba Walker and Al Jefferson were the 2 main players on the team. But if we're going to go beyond the article, and I'm sorry to my guy Chris, I know Carmelo is one of, if not your favorite Knick of all time, but if we're going to keep it real, which I always like to tell myself that I'm a realistic, Carmelo's time with the New York Knicks was a disappointment. Now, can you put all the blame onto Carmelo Anthony? No, you also got to put the blame on Phil Jackson and the management that he did while he was with the New York Knicks, putting Carmelo Anthony in a very, very bad situation, not putting the talent around him in order to succeed. But if we put that to the side, I'm not excusing it, but let's put it to the side. Let's talk about the trade that brought Carmelo Anthony to the New York Knicks. It's important to mention that before the Denver Nuggets traded Carmelo Anthony to the New York Knicks, he did sign a contract extension prior to the trade. Melo didn't have to do that. It was towards the end of that season where Carmelo Anthony was going to be a free agent. But in many interviews since then, Carmelo Anthony has always said that the way he was raised, if the money was put in front of him, you don't walk away from money. And in his case, he didn't walk away from the money. He signed a contract extension, but he still demanded to be traded from the Denver Nuggets. Now, if he didn't sign that contract extension with Denver, he could have waited till the summer where he was a free agent, and the Knicks didn't have to give up the amount of assets that they did in order to get Carmelo Anthony. Yes, we did get Carmelo Anthony, who ended up becoming a NBA legend, a New York Knicks legend, but you can argue that the amount of assets that we had to give up, it kind of put the New York Knicks in a bad position. So speaking of the assets, they traded away Wilson Chandler, Danilo Gallinari, Raymond Felton, center Timothy Mozgov, and they also traded a future first-round draft selection and 2 future second-round draft selections, as well as the right to exchange 2016 first-round draft selections and cash considerations on top of it. If we're taking the draft selections and the cash, if we're putting that to the side, let's take a look at the actual players. We're talking about Wilson Chandler, Danilo Gallinari, Raymond Felton, and Timothy Mozgov. At the time, those 4 players were essential parts of the rotation in the New York Knicks. And in that moment as well, we signed Amari Stoudemire prior to that season. So the starting 5 looked like Amari, Wilson, Danilo, Raymond Felton, and the 5th player maybe was Tony Douglas. I'm not entirely sure. Oh, no, it was Landry Fields. And I remember the first half of that season, the Knicks were on fire. Amari was actually having 30-point games, and I believe he tied, if not broke the record for consecutive 30-point games as a New York Knick. It might have been like 7, 8, somewhere within that range. But then again, right before the All-Star break, the Knicks decided to make the trade, and they gave up all those players. Now, let's take a look at the rest of the season. The Knicks did end up making the playoffs, but they ended up getting swept in 4 games against the Boston Celtics. And in that series, Amari Stoudemire went down with a back injury where he was having just complications with his back and muscles were flaring up, and he wasn't really there to help Carmelo Anthony. Anthony in the games within those playoffs, let's take a look at his stats. First game, he dropped 15 points, shooting 5 of 18 from the field, shooting 2 of 8 from 3. Not a great game one in the series. In game two, he dropped 42 points. He had 14 of 30 from the field and 4 of 8 from three. So far, game two of the series was the best game of the series. In game three, he ended up with 15 points, 4 of 16 from the field, and 1 of 3 from three. And in the last game where they ended up getting swept, he dropped 32 points, had 10 of 24 from the field, and 2 of 7 from three-point land. So as far as that series, his best game was in game two where he dropped 42 points. But again, the Knicks ended up getting swept by the Boston Celtics in 4 games. Now, let's fast forward to the season after that in 2012 when they ended up going up against the Miami Heat. Of course, at the time, it was LeBron, it was Bosh, it was Wade, the big three. They ended up losing in 5 games. And within those 5 games, let's take a look at Melo's numbers. In the first game, he dropped 11 points where he was 3 of 15 from the field. He was 0 of 2 from three-point. Not a great game one in the series. In game two, he had 30 points where he dropped 12 of 26 from the field and he was 0 of 3 from three. In the third game, 22 points, 7 of 23 from the field and 1 of 4 from three. In the fourth game, which is where they won 1 game, he dropped 41 points, 15 of 29, and 1 of 4 from three. And in the last game, 35 points, he dropped 15 of 31 from the field and 2 of 5 from three-point land. Up until this point, I don't want to put Carmelo Anthony as the sole reason as to why the Knicks didn't have as much success as everybody expected them to have. But Carmelo Anthony at the time was regarded as one of the best players in the league. It's kind of hard to put my mind frame back in that time, but I think you can argue and say that Carmelo Anthony was a top 10 player in the league. And if you have a top 10 player in the league, the player should be able to give you more than one game. And again, the argument could be had that he's going up against the Miami Heat, the big three. The Miami Heat were the leaders in the Eastern Conference, and Amari Stoudemire was always on and off with health injuries, and injuries plagued him. Now, the following season is when the Knicks finally had some success. They were able to get past the first round where they beat the Boston Celtics in 6 games. And then after that, in the second round, they went up against the Indiana Pacers where they lost in 6. This was the first season where Carmelo Anthony, you can say, actually had a legitimate chance to make something of his Knicks legacy, if you will. And that year, they got Jason Kidd, J.R. Smith, they got Tyson Chandler. Amari was on and off with injuries. He was still dealing with his injuries. Iman Shumpert was on the team. Kurt Thomas. They had a nice blend of young players, but they also had a mix of veterans that were able to keep the young guys in check. And Melo was the offensive focal point of the team. And I believe Melo was maybe 3rd in MVP voting. Now, unfortunately, after that season, this is where things started really going left. Phil Jackson ended up becoming the GM of the New York Knicks, and he ended up trading away all the pieces. He traded Iman, he traded JR to Cleveland Cavaliers, and he got Jason Kidd left. Tyson Chandler left. Like a lot of things ended up just going left, and Carmelo was left with nothing. They ended up drafting Kristaps Porzingis. Kristaps Porzingis had a great rookie year, a great sophomore year, but he ended up tearing his ACL, missing an entire season. It was just a lot of up and down with Carmelo and the whole Knicks organization. Carmelo Anthony coming into the league was drafted 3rd by the Denver Nuggets, and everybody knew that Carmelo Anthony was a really big offensive threat. But my gripe with Melo is after a few seasons of being in the league, seeing the success that LeBron James was having, seeing the success that Dwayne Wade was having, and also Chris Bosh was having, I felt like Melo never got the picture as far as trying to develop his all-around game. Melo came into the league as an offensive player, and he sticked with that. He did not change his all-around game. He did not try to make his teammates better. The way that he thought of making his teammates better was actually scoring. Now, as far as Melo and an offensive player, if we're ranking isolation offensive players, Melo has to be in the conversation as one of the best, if not the best. Melo, as far as his offensive prowess, he could put the ball on the floor. He added the three-point shot to his game. As far as mid-range, as far as post-ups, the fadeaways, Melo had it all. He had the footwork. He had the little crossover. Melo had the entire repertoire for his offensive game. But if you're in the league for a certain amount of time and you don't really try to change your ways, then And if you're the leader of one of the teams, then you could put the blame on Melo. Melo never really tried to change his all-around game in order to make his teammates better. The only thing Melo knew was to put the ball in the hoop, which of course we needed, but when there were times, the season after Phil Jackson became the GM and he traded away all those players, yes, Melo wasn't left with a lot of talent, And Melo did end up struggling, but Melo at the same time, I feel like he didn't take the responsibility of being the leader on the team, trying to incorporate his guys, trying to make his guys better. Instead, Melo just decided to do what he does best, which is score. But if you're just scoring and you're not trying to do anything on the defensive end or try and incorporate your guys, then how can you become successful? In the article, they also talk about Carmelo Anthony and getting his number retired in MSG. And if we take a look here, Melo says, "This is New York. To go up in the rafters of Madison Square Garden, it's like you went up in the rafters of the world. When it happens, or if it happens, then I'll deal with it at that point in time. Until then, I'll keep looking up at the rafters." Now, this is an interesting point because if you ask Knicks fans if Melo should get his number retired in MSG, I feel like there will be a divide because Melo, in his tenure with the New York Knicks, which I believe was 7 seasons, he was able to get past the first round of the playoffs once, where he ended up losing in 6 games to the Indiana Pacers, and you can argue that the Knicks should have won that series. Other than that, it was first round exits and no playoffs. I feel like you can make a better argument for Melo getting his jersey retired with the Denver Nuggets. Melo actually finished third in Denver Nuggets history as far as scoring. He ended up with 13,970 points, only behind Dan Issel with 16,589, and behind Alex English, who finished with 21,645 points. And Melo's tenure with the Denver Nuggets, he led them to a Western Conference Finals. He led them consistently into the playoffs. Now, far be it that they lost in the first round, but every team that he went up against, they had a better team. One of them including San Antonio Spurs, where they ended Melo's rookie season, he went up against the San Antonio Spurs in 2003, where the San Antonio Spurs actually won the championship. If you're asking me personally if Melo should get his number retired at MSG, I'm going to say no. Melo coming to the Knicks, unfortunately, had a lot of expectations. And unfortunately, none of those expectations were realized. He ended up losing in the playoffs consistently, not even getting past the second round, where we thought that there would be at least one Eastern Conference Finals berth, and we never got that. And as far as the other Knicks that do have their jerseys retired at MSG, we got Patrick Ewing, Willis Reed, Walt Clyde Frazier, Earl of Pearl Monroe. Those players, they have championships, or they were actually in the Eastern Conference Finals every single year, a la Patrick Ewing. Patrick Ewing, I feel like, is one of the most disrespected centers in NBA history. Now, when you compare him to the likes of David Robinson, Shaquille O'Neal, Hakeem Olajuwon, Patrick Ewing might be towards the end of that list. But if we're talking about just Knicks great, Patrick Ewing is right behind Walt Clyde Frazier, Earl of Pearl, Willis Reed, because Patrick unfortunately doesn't have a ring, but he was able to lead his team to an actual championship where they lost eventually to the Houston Rockets in 6. Willis Reed, Earl of Pearl, and Walt Clyde, they actually have 2 rings. Carmelo wasn't even able to get past the second round of the playoffs. There was no Eastern Conference Finals berth. The Knicks were not a threat in the Eastern Conference in most of Carmelo Anthony's tenure with the New York Knicks. But we can't take away from Melo's career. Melo actually ended up in the top 10 of NBA scorers of all time. Melo currently is at number 9 with 28,289 points. He more than likely he will get passed up by Kevin Durant, who's not too far behind him with 27,000 points, 192. So overall, Melo's tenure with the Knicks was disappointing. We were glad we had him when we did. Unfortunately, he was not able to provide what Knicks fans expected, which was an Eastern Conference Finals berth or maybe even an NBA Finals berth. But again, it's not to take away from anything from his legacy. He was a great NBA player. He was a great New York Knick. But as far as becoming immortalized and getting your jersey retired in the rafters, I don't personally think so. But guys, please leave your comments down below. Let me know if you agree with me or if you disagree with me, and we'll check you out in the next video. Peace.